Chapter 11 in APES is going to deal with human impacts on terrestrial biodiversity. Terrestrial, of course, means land, so think about it that way. Basically, all the changes we've made, you've got to realize that obviously we need to survive, so we need to use the Earth's resources. Unfortunately, we've degraded anywhere from 50 to 83%, which is a huge range of land surface. Cleared about 82% of temperate forests like we live in, mainly for farming. Logged to 95% of the forests. We use, of course, forests for building things like houses and use it for things like paper. Unfortunately, a lot of it's waste, and we've done a lot of destruction. It's affected about 40% of our world's NPP, which that means is if we were much more efficient, we could actually support our higher population that we are getting. And of course, we've increased extinction rate anywhere from 100 to 10,000 times, a huge range there, of course. But before us, extinction rate was a much more normal background-like extinction rate. And what we're doing is, because losing habitat is the #1 reason for becoming extinct, we are destroying, we're deforesting in particular a lot of land, and that's causing a lot of species to become. So what do we need to do? Preservation of biodiversity. We need to save things for the intrinsic. In other words, that inside feeling that we have it there, or existence value, just knowing it's there is a good thing. Of course, we get goods and services if we do things like Haiti. Haiti's a practical example of deforesting pretty much everything on their tiny island nation, and now they don't have any trees there, and then they get devastated by an earthquake, and that made things even worse. Scientific information we need to gather. What if the cure for cancer is out there in the tropical rainforest and we're actually destroying the tropical rainforest? Recreation, of course, and ecological services. We do value natural beauty. Go to our national parks, which we'll talk about later in this chapter. And we need to, of course, leave some capital for future generations, which comes with sustainability. So we have this whole area of biology called conservation biology, or conserving the resources that we have. It uses rapid response strategies to curb loss and degradation of the world's biodiversity. So it's really a bunch of scientists and political activists that actually try to save these areas before they become permanently destroyed. Unfortunately, we really can't control much outside the United States. There are things called hotspots. Hawaii is actually deemed a hotspot because it's got very fragile ecosystems, and of course, as we build more and we get more tourism in that area, they can be destroyed very easily. We have rapid assessment teams. They evaluate, they make recommendations, and of course take emergency actions. They include tools that have high-resolution images. The beauty of satellite imagery right now is we can keep an eye on a lot of regions, particularly areas like Brazil, which has the largest remaining tropical rainforest, and making sure they're not destroying it too fast. And we're using DNA sequences for identifying, seeing what species are going extinct, and maybe actually even discovering new on the way. Public lands in the U.S., so lands that are available for you and I to visit, sometimes at a cost, they help preserve biodiversity and lessen human impact on our planet. The U.S. has set aside more land than any other nation, so we are protecting a large amount. Think about Yosemite National Park as a great example. There's different classifications, which we're going to go through now. There's national forests and resource lands, which is governed by the United States Forest Service. The Nicolet National Forest, which is in northern Wisconsin, is a good example of this. What is allowed on that land is logging, so cutting down trees, mining, grazing, oil drilling, gas drilling, and recreation. A little bit more protected in a little bit different way is something called a National Wildlife Refuge. It's a refugee. It's a protected area that's governed by the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. What happens is we protect habitats and breeding grounds. So keep that in mind. A refugee, we protect those habitats, those breeding grounds. Just north of here, of course, we have the Horicon Marsh, which is deemed a refugee area. Very protected because that's where a lot of the Canadian geese actually do reproduction, among a lot of other creatures too. These areas do allow for some hunting, some trapping, some fishing, some mining, some log cutting down, or logging rather, little grazing of animals, and of course there's a little farming that's allowed on these refugees too, but of course those habitats and breeding grounds are protected. Here's some areas that in the United States you can see we have quite a bit. Looking particularly at Wisconsin, If you look at the western part of Wisconsin, right along the Mississippi River there, we do have a lot of national wildlife refuges. That's actually a corridor, it's called, where animals will actually migrate and breed. Northern Wisconsin, like I said, we've got a bunch of forests up there. And of course, on the Minnesota border, we've got some national parks and preserves up here, which we'll do a little activity in class and talk about. Northern Minnesota has the whole Boundary Waters area, which is protected, but most of these are actually out west. So if you ever travel out there, of course, lots of preserve systems. Alaska is a phenomenal amount. If you take a look at Alaska, lots of protected public land up there. Great, because it's a really pristine environment. National Park System is another type of federal land or public land that's governed by the National Park Service. It allows camping, hiking, sport fishing, boating, not hunting though. It does not allow mining or oil either. A National Park System would be like Yosemite National Park. National Wilderness Preservation System, only recreational use. This is probably the most protected. Once again, National Wilderness Preservation System, we're preserving that land, very protected. If you take a look at this, these are some hot spots around the planet. Critical and endangered species. If you take a look at the United States, well, that's where a lot of people live, of course, in this area right here. And we're pushing a lot of species out. Europe, very industrialized, trying to grow a lot of food for their populations, very critical and endangered regions. Some areas are threatened, which is in the yellow. Stable or intact, of course, is kind of ironically areas where people do not live. If you take a look at Russia, if you take a look at northern Canada, Alaska, not a lot of people live there, thus there's not a lot of endangered or threatened species. A lot of controversy over public lands, because quite honestly, we have a lot of public lands. There's lots of people that would like to make a little money off of it. From an environmentalist approach, we need to protect that biodiversity and habitat. Really, we shouldn't get any subsidies for taking resources. In other words, private companies really shouldn't get any subsidies of money backing from government in order to do it. Think of subsidies as like when you pay taxes on gas, a lot of that tax goes to the oil companies and helps them find more oil. So a little controversy there. Compensation to public for use. So in other words, if mining companies, for example, go in on a refugee, which is not a good idea, maybe we should get some money back for that. Extractors pay for damage. That's a huge problem. We'll talk about that more when we do mining. The federal government does give billions yearly to private interests because, and of course, we need a lot of these resources. On the other hand, developers and extractors want new laws. They want selling of land at less than market value, of course. They want to make money off of it. They want to slash federal funding for administration of land, so reduce the National Park Service people, for example. Cut old trees and replant with plantations. Talk plantations down the road. Open land to drilling, dismantling National Park Service, and in some cases it's actually been proposed to slash an area of Yosemite and actually build a theme park there, and that's devastating to the natural beauty of it. Support the 1872 mining law. That's a law that we'll talk about again down the road when we talk mining, but it's really cheap to buy land. It's mind-blowing, actually. Repeal the Endangered Species Act, and obviously these are extreme. Decreasing wetlands, so not worry about wetlands and protecting them as much as we do. Not allow public to legally challenge private use plans. We need to manage and sustain these forests. Forests with at least 10% tree cover occupy about 30% of the Earth's surface, excluding Greenland and Antarctica. So we've got a lot of trees, that basically says, across our planet. We need to protect them. Forests are classified according to age and structure, which will... Now, the first classification is old growth or frontier. Think about big mature trees. Think about the redwoods out in California. That is old growth. They've been around for hundreds, if not longer, years. Not seriously disturbed by humans. They're very natural, goes through natural succession. Land at less than market value because it's basically not worth a lot of money. Large amounts of diversity. The problem is there are logging companies that do want to go in and devastate these areas. So old growth, again, think big mature trees. Second growth, is after secondary succession, generally developed after human activities or natural forces. So if we go in and cut down a bunch of trees, stuff, nature does rebound very quickly, and it's going to rebound generally quickly after secondary succession because all the nutrients are there. The next one are tree plantations and tree farms, and of course we've got a picture like that in Wisconsin. A lot of tree farms up in central Wisconsin. You can even think about it if you go to Door County, all the apple and cherry trees. The idea of that is you cut an area, then you replant it with the type of species that you want in there. So you can see on the right, that's of course Christmas trees, and which makes a lot of people a lot of money. So at one time that was probably even farmers' fields, and then they planted something. Type of management, there's something called even-aged management that maintains trees about the same age and size in a forest. So all the trees that are 10 years old, they leave those, they cut down the rest. It replaces an old growth or secondary forest. So what they would do is go in and clear cut a forest, so cut everything down, except some trees that are 10 to 12 years old, for example, and they'll save those. And the reason is then down the road, they'll cut those when they're more mature and ideally plant some more. Uneven age, variety of ages and species, this is actually much better because it promotes diversity. Well, big trees will have little trees, and what it'll do, and we'll have brush in there. What that does is it actually can get a much more diverse amount of species in there. They selectively cut various age trees that can be used for timber, wildlife, and recreation. So uneven ages actually are much more eco-friendly. The problem is, and look at that cool picture on there, which looks like a tree. Those are logging roads. The problem is, once we allow companies to go into new area, what happens is these logging roads open it up to erosion, sediment runoff. In other words, when it rains, all those sediments run off to that, affect habitats and loss of biodiversity. In general, when you cut down forests like this, what happens is it does increase erosion. It opens it up to non-native pests and diseases. It actually destroys habitats. Of course, that can lead to extinction. And we can get things like human pests and ticks that come out of there. So basically, the more we go into these forests like this, the more we're exposed to, and it's not a real good thing overall. Once logging roads are in an area, it does disqualify land for protection as wilderness. So there is a big fight between the government and private industry to allow logging roads in, which is not always a good idea. You can just see a little picture right here where they came in with a logging road, and they're going to start slashing and burning. So they're cutting down forests and burning, and you can see they're planting specific trees back here, or even farms. Maybe if it's specific trees, it's a plantation, or it could be farming. We have a lot of old growth there. What this does is it opens up disease, not only to get into these trees, but it also can allow them to get out too, and into areas that should be protected. So what's happening is eventually those logging roads could be made into highways. This happens in the great northwestern part of the United States, out in Washington and Oregon. And then what happens is we're clearing things for grazing of cattle and clearing it for agriculture. Again, we're losing that biodiversity. All right, that's it for the first lecture. We'll get to the second one soon.